In May 2005, a man was found shot dead and dumped near a Georgia middle school. The killing didn't just grow out of a street dispute. It was the direct result of a corporate proxy war over a hit record called Icy. As the fight over the track intensified, it escalated into a fatal armed home invasion, where robbery, retaliation, and intellectual property became inseparably entangled. While Gucci Mane was handcuffed and charged with murder for defending his own life, the executives at Def Jam Records calmly collected millions from a blood-soaked record. This is the dark reality of how a multi-billion-dollar label turned a Gucci Mane song into a real murder. But a publishing contract doesn't turn into a homicide overnight. The blueprint for this industry-fueled bloodshed was drafted long before the trigger was ever pulled. The American music industry, at the turn of the millennium, was undergoing a massive geographic and cultural shift. For decades, New York and Los Angeles had dictated the sound and the commerce of hip-hop. But by the early 2000s, the epicenter had moved permanently to the south, specifically Atlanta, Georgia. A new subgenre called trap was emerging. It was not polished or poetic. It was a dark, visceral, and uncomfortably literal documentation of the crack cocaine trade, built on booming bass lines and harrowing street realities. The major record labels descended on Atlanta looking for local talent to monetize. They were looking beyond traditional musicians, hunting for authentic, street-hardened individuals whose dangerous lifestyles could be packaged, sanitized just enough for radio, and sold to millions of suburban consumers. They needed artists who did not just rap about violence, but who actually lived it. They needed the trauma to be verifiable. In this predatory environment, two men emerged as the absolute titans of the underground, yet they occupied entirely different realities. J. Wayne Jenkins, known as Young Jeezy, was not just a rapper. He was a highly connected, heavily insulated operator in the Atlanta underworld. Born in 1977, Jeezy carried major street cachet, in part because of his associations and the powerful network surrounding him, including figures connected to BMF. At the time, BMF was one of the most powerful, wealthy, and feared organized crime syndicates in the United States. Jeezy was their chosen voice. When he transitioned into music, he did not have to struggle for studio time, independent distribution, or basic promotion. His street credibility was formidable, and he appeared to have access to resources far beyond those available to most independent Atlanta rappers. This immense leverage immediately caught the attention of the corporate music machine. L.A. Reid, the legendary executive heading Def Jam Records, saw a goldmine in Young Jeezy. Def Jam offered him a massive multi-million-dollar contract. Jeezy was rapidly groomed to be the next global superstar. He was given the best producers, the largest marketing budgets, and the full weight of a global distribution network. He was the corporate darling. He possessed both the terrifying respect of the streets and the boardroom backing of a multinational conglomerate. He was insulated from the bottom up, operating in the exact same city but existing in a state of perpetual survival. Was Radrick Delantic Davis. Gucci Mane was born in 1980 in rural Bessemer, Alabama, before moving to the unforgiving environment of East Atlanta. Unlike Jeezy, Gucci did not have the backing of a massive crime syndicate or a billionaire record executive. He was an independent hustler. He was a man who had sold drugs to survive and viewed music simply as a slightly less lethal way to generate income. Gucci Mane was a survivor in the truest, most exhausting sense of the word. He operated out of the basement studio of a local producer named Zaytoven. He recorded tracks at a frantic, desperate pace and sold his own CDs out of the trunk of his car. He had no corporate safety net. If he failed, he went back to the corner or he went to a prison cell. Because of this, he possessed a fierce, deeply ingrained paranoia. When you build your life in the illicit drug trade, your primary psychological baseline is the constant anticipation of betrayal and robbery. You learn to sleep with one eye open. You learn that weakness is an invitation for death. Gucci owned his own independent imprint, LaFleur Entertainment. He was entirely self-funded. Every dollar he made, he kept, but every risk he took, he absorbed alone. He owned his master recordings, which in the music business is the ultimate currency. By late 2004, Gucci Mane recognized a ceiling on his independent hustle. To elevate his label from a local operation to a national business, he needed a crossover hit. He needed to collaborate with the biggest name in the city to legitimize his upcoming independent debut album, Trap House. He reached out to young Jeezy's camp. At this moment, there was no hostility between the two men. It was a straightforward, pragmatic business transaction. Gucci Mane paid young Jeezy his standard fee to provide a guest verse on a track. They met in the studio. They recorded a song called Icy. The track was an anomaly for both artists. It was not a dark, brooding tale of street survival. It was an upbeat, infectious, highly marketable anthem about jewelry, success, and status. It possessed a commercial viability that neither artist had fully captured before. Gucci Mane paid for the studio time. He paid for the instrumental beat. He paid Jeezy for his vocal contribution. Under every standard metric of copyright law and industry practice, the song legally and morally belonged to Radrick Davis. It was his property. Almost immediately upon its completion in early 2005, Icy caught fire. It leaked to the streets and was quickly picked up by local radio stations. Within weeks, it was the most requested song in Atlanta, and its popularity began spreading rapidly across the American South. The song was a certified, undeniable hit. For Gucci Mane, it was the ultimate vindication. He held the master recording. It was going to serve as the lead single for his album. It was his ticket out of the trap and into generational wealth. He had successfully crossed over without giving a percentage of his publishing to a major label. But the sudden explosive success of Icy triggered a crisis within the corporate offices of Def Jam Records in New York. The executives were preparing to launch young Jeezy's major label debut album, Let's Get It, Thug Motivation 101. The label had invested millions of dollars into Jeezy's rollout. They had the street anthems, but they were missing a crucial component. They needed a mainstream, radio-friendly single to ensure the album crossed over to pop audiences and recouped their massive investment. The executives heard Icy dominating the airwaves. They ran the numbers. The publishing rights, the mechanical royalties, and the performance revenues for a song of that magnitude were worth millions of dollars. Def Jam did not want young Jeezy to simply be a featured artist on a track owned by an unknown independent rapper. That was bad business. They wanted the song for themselves. They wanted to strip Icy from Gucci Mane's Trap House and place it squarely onto young Jeezy's highly anticipated corporate debut. Many industry insiders suggest the immense pressure to acquire the song came directly from the top, secure the rights to Icy, and make it a Young Jeezy record. Jeezy's management approached Gucci Mane to negotiate the handover of the master recording. They expected the independent artist to fold. This is the standard operational procedure of the music industry. A major label uses its immense financial weight and industry connections to intimidate independent artists into surrendering their rights. Furthermore, Jeezy had the backing of Def Jam and the muscle of BMF. For a street-level rapper from East Atlanta, standing in the way of that kind of combined corporate and criminal power was universally considered suicide. You take the buyout, you take the exposure, and you walk away. But Gucci Mane refused. This refusal was not born of arrogance. It was a pure, unfiltered trauma response. When a man has spent his entire life in an environment where people constantly try to take what belongs to him, yielding is not an option. Gucci Mane understood that giving up the master recording of Icy meant handing over the greatest financial asset he had ever created. He had paid for it. It was his. To surrender it to Def Jam would be to allow himself to be robbed legally. He politely but firmly declined the offer. He proceeded to shoot the music video without Jeezy's blessing and continued to push the song under his own independent label. This refusal is the exact moment the corporate mechanism turned malignant. When standard business negotiations fail in the legitimate world, corporations file lawsuits. They tie the asset up in litigation for years until the smaller party goes bankrupt from legal fees. But Def Jam was not dealing with a standard pop artist. They were dealing in the currency of gangsta rap. The corporate machine knows that lawsuits are inefficient, public, and slow. They also know that when you are managing an artist whose entire brand is built on street authenticity, applying pressure on the street level yields immediate results. Def Jam did not draft a memo ordering an assault on Gucci Mane. They did not have to. They simply communicated to their artist that obtaining the rights to this song was an absolute necessity for his album's success and his corporate standing. By placing that immense commercial pressure on young Jeezy, and knowing full well the violent environment he operated in, the label effectively weaponized his ego. They pitted a corporate-backed giant against a solitary, paranoid survivor. The executives set the stage for a conflict where intellectual property would be negotiated not with contracts and attorneys, but with intimidation and firearms. They lit the fuse, stepped back into the shadows, and waited for the street to do the dirty work of corporate acquisition. When a multinational corporation requires an asset, it does not accept refusal. However, when that corporation is dealing in the volatile currency of gangsta rap, it cannot send a team of lawyers to issue a subpoena. It must use the language of the environment it is exploiting. By the spring of 2005, the executives at Def Jam Records had made it abundantly clear to young Jeezy and his management that securing the rights to the hit song Icy was not optional. It was a fundamental requirement for the launch of his major label debut. The corporate pressure applied to Jeezy was immense. He was being positioned as the savior of Southern hip-hop, the flagship artist for a multi-billion-dollar entity, and his street credibility was his primary marketing tool. He could not, under any circumstances, allow an independent, relatively unknown artist like Gucci Mane to hold him hostage over a publishing credit. Jeezy's ego, heavily inflated by the backing of both Def Jam and the Black Mafia family, could not tolerate the defiance. if Gucci Mane would not sign the paperwork in a boardroom. Jeezy would force him to surrender it on the pavement. The strategy shifted from financial negotiation to public humiliation and physical intimidation. The sheer cruelty of this mechanism relied heavily on the absolute power of commercial radio in the early 2000s. Before the total dominance of social media, urban radio stations were the absolute epicenters of cultural power. They were not merely broadcasters of music, they were the arbiters of street credibility. For the hip-hop community in Atlanta, Hot 107.9 was the most powerful frequency in the city. The executives who ran these stations were entirely aware of the power they wielded, and they were driven by the exact same capitalist motives as the record labels: ratings, listener engagement, and advertising revenue. Conflict was their most profitable commodity. Jeezy utilized this corporate media apparatus to execute a street-level shakedown. He went on the radio to publicly address the dispute over Icy. Bypassing any talk of royalties, publishing splits, or copyright law, he instead spoke the unfiltered language of the cartel. Broadcasting to hundreds of thousands of listeners across the state of Georgia, young Jeezy issued a direct, unequivocal threat to Radric Davis. He mocked Gucci Mane. He questioned his authenticity. And then he crossed a line that transformed a contract dispute into a lethal hunt. Jeezy announced a $10,000 bounty to anyone who could bring him Gucci Mane's signature So Icy diamond chain. To a demographic aged 50 to 70, unfamiliar with the highly codified sociology of hip-hop, a necklace might seem like a trivial piece of jewelry. It is not. In this specific subculture, a custom diamond chain is the ultimate physical manifestation of a man's financial autonomy, his success, and his physical invulnerability. To rob a man of his chain is the absolute highest form of disrespect. It is the modern equivalent of capturing a rival general's sword on the battlefield. It is an act of total emasculation. Jeezy knew that if someone snatched Gucci Mane's chain, Gucci's career would be instantly annihilated. He would be branded a coward, his independent label would collapse, and he would be forced into submission. He would have to hand over the rights to Icy just to survive the humiliation. This radio broadcast was a masterclass in corporate complicity. When young Jeezy issued a $10,000 contract for the robbery of another human being on live air, the radio host did not cut the microphone. They did not call the authorities. They laughed. They amplified the threat. They recognized that the palpable impending violence would drive their ratings to record highs. At the label level, no meaningful effort appeared to be made to cool the conflict, even as the dispute was escalating into something far more dangerous than a music feud. They did absolutely nothing to intervene. In fact, they benefited directly from it. The controversy surrounding the bounty generated a massive, entirely free marketing campaign for Jeezy's upcoming album. The music press picked up the story. The streets were buzzing. The label used the very real, terrifying risk to a man's life to stimulate consumer curiosity and drive pre-orders for Thug Motivation 101. They transformed a violent bounty into promotional leverage. For Radric Davis, the radio broadcast was not a marketing stunt. It was a death sentence. Gucci Mane was suddenly a hunted man in his own city. The psychological impact of having a public bounty placed on your head is devastating. It induces a state of permanent, suffocating hypervigilance. $10,000 in East Atlanta in 2005 was a life-changing amount of money for the desperate, impoverished young men who occupied the corners. Gucci knew that every traffic light, every gas station, every recording studio, and every nightclub was now a potential ambush point. He could not trust his peripheral vision. Anyone walking toward him could be a wolf looking for a payday. He was trapped in an impossible paradox, engineered by the corporate machine. He could not call the police and report the threat. In the deeply entrenched culture of the streets, cooperating with law enforcement is the ultimate taboo. If he went to the police, his reputation as a hardened trap rapper would be destroyed, and his music would become commercially worthless. Furthermore, he could not simply surrender the chain or the rights to the song. To yield to the intimidation would signal weakness, and in his environment, weakness invited predators. If he gave up the rights to Icy because he was scared, he would be extorted for the rest of his life. Gucci Mane was backed into a psychological corner where the only viable exit strategy was extreme violence. The trauma of his upbringing in the drug trade had explicitly programmed his survival instincts. When a man who has sold narcotics to survive is threatened, he does not negotiate. He arms himself. He prepares for war. Gucci Mane began carrying heavy weaponry everywhere he went. He slept with a firearm within arm's reach. The psychological exhaustion of this daily reality is profound. He was a musician trying to run an independent business, but the corporate demands of Def Jam and the ego of young Jeezy had forced him to adopt the daily routines of an active combatant. The tension in Atlanta reached a boiling point in May 2005. The song Icy was still climbing the charts, generating massive revenue, serving as a constant, mocking reminder to Jeezy's camp that they had failed to secure the asset. The bounty was still active. The radio stations continued to play the song, feeding the hostility. The system had primed the explosive. It only required a spark to detonate. That spark materialized on the evening of May 10th, 2005. Gucci Mane was exhausted. The paranoia of being a marked man was wearing heavily on his psyche. Seeking a brief respite from the constant surveillance of the streets, he visited the apartment of a female companion in Decator, a city situated just east of Atlanta. He believed he was moving discreetly. He believed he had slipped under the radar for the night. He was gravely mistaken. The mechanism of the bounty had already done its work. The promise of $10,000 and the favor of the powerful black mafia family had mobilized ambitious, violent men. A crew of individuals associated with young Jeezy's camp had tracked Gucci Mane's movements. Among them was Henry Lee Clark III, known as Pookie Locke. Pookie Locke was a rapper himself, a close associate of Jeezy's, who had traveled up from Macon, Georgia. He was looking to make a name for himself, looking to secure the bag, and looking to strip Gucci Mane of his chain, his pride, and his intellectual property. While Gucci Mane rested in the apartment, completely unaware that his location had been compromised, a group of men dressed in black approached the residence. They were armed. They were motivated by the corporate-sponsored bounty hanging over Gucci's head. The men who breached the door weren't holding Def Jam contracts or publishing splits. They came carrying duct tape and loaded firearms. The corporate executives in New York were asleep in their penthouses, their hands completely clean, insulated by thousands of miles and millions of dollars. The radio DJs who had amplified the death threat had gone home for the evening, having successfully boosted their advertising rates. The bureaucratic machinery of the music industry had outsourced its violent acquisition strategy to the desperate men creeping through the Georgia darkness. The stage was set for a bloodbath. Radric Davis, a man who had fought his entire life to escape poverty, was about to be violently punished for refusing to hand over the fruits of his labor to a billionaire corporation. The men approaching the door were operating under the assumption that they were hunting a victim. They severely underestimated the absolute terrifying resolve of a man who had already decided that he would rather commit murder than surrender his property. The collision between corporate greed and street-level survival was seconds away from tearing a hole in the night. The silence of the Decator apartment was shattered with terrifying, violent suddenness. Late in the evening of May 10th, 2005, the door was kicked off its hinges. 5 men, dressed in dark clothing and heavily armed, poured into the narrow confines of the residence. They did not announce themselves. They moved with the frantic, adrenaline-fueled aggression of men executing a targeted strike. The objective was clear: secure the $10,000 bounty, strip Radric Davis of his diamond chain, and deliver the ultimate humiliation required to force the surrender of the Icy Master recording. Gucci Mane was caught entirely off guard. He was visiting a female companion completely separated from his usual security apparatus. The attackers immediately assaulted the woman, threatening her life and demanding to know where the jewelry and the cash were hidden. They stormed toward the bedroom, shouting threats, waving handguns, and anticipating a total surrender. They expected a terrified musician cowering in the corner, ready to hand over his property to save his own life. They fundamentally misunderstood the psychological composition of the man they were hunting. Radric Davis had not been raised in the safety of performing art schools or corporate boardrooms. He was a product of the East Atlanta trap. His psychological baseline had been forged in an environment where hesitation equals death. When a man who has survived the drug trade is cornered in a room by armed assailants, he does not freeze. His autonomic nervous system bypasses conscious thought and defaults to lethal self-preservation. Gucci Mane did not plead for his life. He did not offer his chain. He reached for his weapon. Hidden within reach was a high-capacity firearm. As the men breached the threshold of the bedroom, demanding the chain that young Jeezy had placed a bounty on, Gucci Mane raised his weapon and opened fire. The reality of a close-quarters shootout is not cinematic. It is deafening, chaotic, and blindingly fast. In the confined space of a small apartment, the roar of the gunfire was physically concussive. Gucci Mane fired repeatedly, discharging his weapon directly into the group of attackers. He was not firing to intimidate, he was firing to kill. It was a desperate, raw act of survival. One of the bullets found its mark. It tore through the chest of Henry Lee Clark III, Pookie Locke. The psychological shock of the gunfire instantly broke the attacker's resolve. The men who had kicked down the door expecting an easy robbery were suddenly facing a man willing to slaughter them. Panic consumed the strike team. As Pookie Locke collapsed, bleeding profusely from a catastrophic chest wound, the remaining assailants scrambled, They dragged their dying comrade out of the bullet-riddled apartment, fleeing the scene in absolute terror. They abandoned the bounty. They abandoned the chain. They loaded Pookie Lock into a vehicle and sped away into the Georgia night. But the loyalty of mercenaries is entirely conditional. As Pookie Lock's life slipped away, his accomplices realized the massive legal liability they were now carrying in the back seat. They did not drive him to an emergency room, where police would ask questions and surveillance cameras would record their faces. Instead, they drove to a wooded area behind Columbia Middle School in Decator. They pulled the bleeding, dying man from the vehicle, dumped his body in the dirt, and drove away. This is the agonizing, unvarnished reality of the corporate proxy war. Pookie Lock was a rapper himself, a man desperately trying to secure a record deal and a better life by aligning with young Jeezy's camp. He had traveled from Macon, Georgia, eager to prove his loyalty, eager to secure the bounty, and eager to please the men who had the backing of Def Jam Records. For his ambition, he was shot through the heart and left to die alone in the dirt behind a middle school, abandoned by the very men he thought were his brothers. He died over a copyright dispute for a song he didn't even write. Back in the apartment, as the smell of cordite filled the air and the adrenaline began to recede, Gucci Mane was left standing in the wreckage. He was physically unharmed, but his life had just been irreversibly fractured. He had successfully defended his property. He still held the master recording to Icy. He still had his chain. But the cost of retaining his intellectual property was the ultimate moral and legal threshold. He had taken a human life. The sheer weight of that realization is crushing. Radrick Davis knew immediately that the narrative would be stripped of its corporate context. The police would not care about Def Jam's release schedule. They would not care about the boardroom pressure applied to young Jeezy. They would only see a dead body, a firearm, and a rapper with a criminal record. Gucci Mane did not attempt to flee the state. He possessed the grim, pragmatic intelligence to know that running from a murder charge is a futile endeavor. He contacted his legal counsel. On May 19, 2005, 9 days after the shooting, Radrick Davis walked into the DeKalb County Police Headquarters and turned himself in. He was immediately arrested, fingerprinted, and charged with felony murder. He was stripped of his clothes, handed a county jail uniform, and locked in a concrete cell, facing the very real prospect of spending the rest of his natural life in a state penitentiary. The media machinery immediately engaged. News outlets across the country ran sensationalized headlines. They framed the story exactly as the corporate executives hoped they would: a violent dispute between rival rap factions. Rapper arrested in murder of rival's associate. The journalists focused entirely on the street-level violence, ignoring the multi-million-dollar corporate extortion that had directly caused it. The reaction from the major record labels was a masterclass in capitalist hypocrisy. Def Jam Records and the corporate executives backing young Jeezy completely distanced themselves from the bloodshed. They possessed total, plausible deniability. No executive had ordered the hit on paper. No corporate funds had been explicitly used to pay the attackers. They had simply applied immense economic pressure, allowed their artists to issue a bounty on public radio, and waited for the ecosystem to resolve the problem. When the problem resulted in a corpse, the executives washed their hands. They expressed no public remorse for the death of Pookie Lock. They offered no legal support to Gucci Mane, the independent artist their demands had forced into becoming a killer. The corporate machine simply stepped over the body and continued the rollout for young Jeezy's album Let's Get It, Thug Motivation 101. In fact, the murder charge fundamentally benefited the corporate narrative. The bloodshed generated an astronomical level of morbid curiosity among the music-consuming public. Young Jeezy's street credibility was now cemented in actual undeniable violence. The feud was no longer a marketing gimmick. It had a body count. Fans rushed to buy Jeezy's album, driven by the dark allure of a man whose words had seemingly commanded an assassination attempt. The executives in New York watched the sales projections skyrocket, their profit margins swelling on the back of a tragedy they had helped engineer. Meanwhile, Radric Davis sat in a freezing county jail cell, isolated from the world. The psychological torment of his situation was absolute. He had killed a man in self-defense, a man who had kicked down a door to rob him, yet he was the one facing life without parole. He had to navigate the excruciatingly slow, terrifying process of the American judicial system. He had to pay exorbitant legal fees, draining the very independent funds he had fought so hard to protect. The injustice of the scenario is staggering. Gucci Mane was being punished by the state for surviving an extortion attempt mandated by a multi-billion-dollar industry. He had to spend his days reviewing autopsy reports and crime scene photographs, while the radio continued to play Icy, the very song that had nearly cost him his life. The royalties from the track were generating massive revenue, but the creator of the music was locked in a cage, forced to negotiate for his freedom, while the men who instigated the violence remained entirely unaccountable. Gucci's legal defense was straightforward, but incredibly difficult to prove in a prejudiced system: self-defense. In the state of Georgia, the law allows a person to use deadly force to prevent death or great bodily injury during the commission of a forcible felony, such as an armed home invasion. The physical evidence strongly supported his claim. The police found bullet holes in the apartment, signs of a forced entry, and witness testimony confirming that 5 armed men had ambushed him. But proving self-defense when you are a young black man with a criminal history involved in the gangsta rap industry is an uphill battle against deeply ingrained systemic bias. The prosecution attempted to paint him not as a victim of a home invasion, but as a willing participant in a gang war. They tried to use his lyrics, his image, and his profession against him, arguing that he had invited the violence. For 6 agonizing months, Gucci Mane remained in legal limbo. The paranoia that had kept him alive in the apartment now began to consume him in the jail cell. He knew that the Black Mafia family and the men loyal to Pookie Lock were furious. He knew that if he beat the murder charge and walked out of the county jail, the bounty on his head would not disappear. It would multiply. The corporate contract dispute had mutated into a blood feud. He was trapped in a vicious, suffocating cycle. He had used a gun to solve a problem created by a contract, and now he was realizing that the gunfire had only permanently locked him into a state of war. The trauma of taking a life, combined with the betrayal of the industry and the looming threat of retaliation, began to fundamentally alter his brain chemistry. Radric Davis was slowly being hardened into a man who could no longer trust anyone, a man who would soon view extreme paranoia not as a symptom, but as a strict requirement for survival. In January 2006, after months of excruciating legal jeopardy, the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office made a quiet, bureaucratic decision that altered the trajectory of Southern hip-hop forever. They dropped the murder charge against Radrick Davis. The physical evidence collected from the Decator apartment was absolute and undeniable. The shattered door frame, the bullet trajectories, and the witness testimonies all painted a singular, indisputable picture of a violent home invasion. The available evidence aligned strongly with Gucci Mane's self-defense claim, and prosecutors ultimately dropped the murder charge. He had used lethal force to repel 5 armed men who had breached his sanctuary to rob him and potentially take his life. Under the eyes of the law, the case was closed. He was handed his personal effects and allowed to walk out of the county jail. But walking out of a concrete cell does not equate to freedom. For Gucci Mane, freedom was an illusion carefully constructed by the legal system. The gavel may have cleared his name in a court of law, but in the unforgiving jurisdiction of the streets, he had just been handed a permanent death sentence. He stepped out of the DeKalb County Jail into a city that was actively hunting him. The death of Henry Lee Clark III, known as Pookie Locke, had not resolved the corporate dispute over the song Icy. It had escalated a copyright disagreement into a blood feud. Young Jeezy's camp, backed by the formidable power and immense wealth of the Black Mafia family, could not allow the killing of their associate to go unanswered. The $10,000 radio bounty that had initiated the violence was no longer about a diamond chain or a publishing credit. It was about retaliation. By helping create the conditions around the conflict, the industry became part of a chain of events that left Gucci Mane trapped in a cycle of violence and paranoia, while Gucci Mane had been sitting in a freezing cell, fighting for his life and hemorrhaging his independent funds on legal fees. The executives at Def Jam Records had been executing their rollout. In July 2005, just 2 months after the fatal shooting, Young Jeezy released his major label debut, Let's Get It, Thug Motivation 101. The album was a colossal, earth-shattering commercial success. It debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 chart and went on to sell millions of copies. The executives in New York threw lavish release parties, popped expensive champagne, and watched their stock options soar. They had successfully minted a new global superstar. And the darkest, most cynical truth of that success was that the blood spilled in Decator acted as the ultimate marketing catalyst. The media spectacle surrounding the murder charge provided Jeezy with a level of terrifying, authentic street credibility that no advertising budget could ever purchase. The suburban consumers buying the album were completely captivated by the real-world violence attached to the music. The label benefited commercially from the notoriety surrounding the violence, even as the human cost became impossible to ignore. They packaged the trauma, the gang ties, and the dead body, slapped a barcode on it, and distributed it to shopping malls across the globe. Simultaneously, Gucci Mane released his independent debut, Trap House. Defying the immense pressure from the major labels, he had successfully retained the rights to Icy, and the song was featured prominently on his record. Despite operating without the multi-million-dollar promotional machinery of Def Jam, Trap House was a massive independent success. The streets of Atlanta, deeply polarized by the conflict, bought the record in droves. From a purely capitalist perspective, the system had won an absolute victory on both fronts. The proxy war had generated two highly lucrative, immensely popular albums. The executives, the distributors, and the radio stations all counted their profits. But the human cost absorbed by the artist to generate that wealth was catastrophic. And for Radrick Davis, the psychological erosion was only just beginning. The decade of self-destruction that followed Gucci Mane's acquittal was driven by a highly corrosive combination: severe post-traumatic stress disorder colliding with active ongoing gang warfare. When a man survives an armed home invasion and is forced to kill another human being at point-blank range, his nervous system is fundamentally rewired. The brain's threat detection center, the amygdala, becomes hyper-aroused and refuses to shut down. After the shooting, Gucci Mane was no longer living like an ordinary independent artist. He was moving through Atlanta like a man under permanent siege. He knew that the men who had kicked down his door were still out there. He knew the syndicate backing them had infinite resources. He could not hire standard corporate security firms because his business model required him to operate in underground nightclubs, unregulated trap houses, and late-night studio sessions. He had to become his own heavily militarized security force. He began carrying heavy, high-capacity weaponry on his person at all times. He slept with an assault rifle next to his bed. He refused to sit with his back to a door. Every vehicle that lingered too long in his rearview mirror was a potential drive-by shooting. Every fan approaching him for an autograph could be a hitman looking to collect the bounty. This level of sustained, suffocating hypervigilance is biologically unsustainable. The human mind cannot process the perpetual anticipation of murder without fracturing. To cope with the unbearable weight of this paranoia, Gucci Mane turned to extreme chemical sedation. He began heavily abusing lean, a highly addictive liquid concoction of prescription promethazine and codeine cough syrup, combined with alcohol and other narcotics. This was not recreational drug use. This was not a musician partying in a VIP section. This was a man desperately trying to anesthetize a deeply traumatized nervous system. The promethazine slowed his racing thoughts. The codeine numbed the terrors of the impending retaliation. He was drinking massive quantities of the syrup simply to numb the screaming alarms in his head, allowing him to walk onto a stage or step into a recording booth without suffering a panic attack. But the self-medication created a devastating paradox. The drugs designed to numb his fear also stripped away his impulse control and clouded his judgment, making him even more erratic and dangerous. The calculating, disciplined, independent businessman who had outmaneuvered Def Jam on a publishing contract was slowly being replaced by a heavily armed, severely addicted, and deeply paranoid volatile force. The music industry, entirely aware of his deteriorating mental state, did absolutely nothing to intervene. Instead, they recognized that his erratic behavior and heavily armed persona were highly marketable commodities. The promoters, the A and R executives, and the media outlets leaned into the villain narrative. They actively booked Gucci Mane and young Jeezy in the same cities, at the same festivals, fully aware that placing these two factions in close proximity was akin to throwing a match into a powder keg. They wanted the tension. They wanted the controversy. If a shootout occurred in a nightclub parking lot, it was simply free press for the next day's hip-hop blogs. Gucci Mane, backed into a corner by a system that refused to view him as a human being, decided that his only viable defense mechanism was absolute, unapologetic aggression. If the industry and the streets wanted him to be the villain, he would play the role with terrifying commitment. He refused to show weakness or remorse. He released a barrage of diss tracks aimed directly at young Jeezy, his associates, and the Black Mafia family. He taunted them over the death of Pookie Lock. He explicitly referenced the failed robbery in his lyrics, daring them to try again. To a casual observer, this behavior appeared to be the arrogant boasting of a cold-blooded killer. But to anyone who understands the psychology of the streets, it was a desperate, high-stakes survival tactic. In the ecosystem of gangsta rap, if your enemies sense that you are afraid, or if they believe the trauma of taking a life has softened your resolve, they will immediately move to execute you. Gucci Mane had to project the image of an untouchable, remorseless monster to deter the hitmen. He was using his music not just to generate income, but to build a psychological fortress around himself. The tragedy of this tactic is that the armor eventually fuses to the skin. The corporate mechanism had forced Radrick Davis to kill a man to protect a copyright, and then the media apparatus had rewarded him for it, turning his trauma into a lucrative, infamous brand. He was trapped in a feedback loop of violence and monetization. Over the next decade, this toxic combination would drag him into a relentless cycle of arrests, incarcerations, violent altercations, and near-fatal overdoses. He was arrested for aggravated assault, for battery, for possession of firearms by a convicted felon. He was constantly in and out of the county jail and state prison systems. He was generating millions of dollars, discovering and launching the careers of future superstars like Migos, Future, and Waka Flocka Flame. Yet he was living the life of a hunted fugitive in his own mind. He was wealthy, but he was entirely impoverished of peace. Meanwhile, young Jeezy continued his ascent into the upper echelons of corporate rap. He became a multi-platinum artist, a respected businessman, and a recognized philanthropist. The corporate machine at Def Jam successfully insulated him from the grim reality of the proxy war they had initiated. They smoothed out his rough edges, dressed him in designer suits, and presented him to the mainstream world as a triumph of the American dream. The executive class completely ignored the fact that the foundation of that specific dream was built on a radio bounty and a corpse dumped behind a middle school. The juxtaposition between the two men over the following decade serves as a brutal indictment of the corporate exploitation of street culture. The artist who had the backing of the billionaires was shielded, polished, and protected by an army of publicists and high-priced attorneys. The independent artist who refused to surrender his publishing was thrown into a psychological meat grinder, forced to navigate severe addiction, PTSD, and the constant threat of assassination, all while the industry happily collected a percentage of his record sales. The feud between Gucci Mane and young Jeezy solidified into the most infamous, deeply entrenched, and dangerous rivalry in the history of Southern hip-hop. It was no longer a dispute over a song. It was a permanent, bleeding wound in the culture of Atlanta. It divided neighborhoods, fractured loyalties, and guaranteed that any time these two men breathed the same air, the threat of mass casualties was imminent. The executives who had ignited the fire in 2005 had long since moved on to new projects, new artists, and new revenue streams, leaving the two gladiators locked in a dark, seemingly endless war of attrition. But the human spirit, even when buried under a mountain of trauma and narcotics, possesses a terrifying capacity for endurance. Radric Davis was marching toward a total catastrophic collapse, a breaking point that would either end his life permanently or force a resurrection that the corporate world could never have predicted. The collision course was set, and the final reckoning for the blood spilled over Icy was still waiting in the shadows. The years between 2006 and 2013 represent one of the darkest, most psychologically grueling periods ever documented in the history of American music. For Radric Davis, the dismissal of his murder charge did not mark the end of the war. It marked the beginning of a relentless, decade-long psychological siege. To the outside world, Gucci Mane was becoming a trap music deity. He was releasing mixtapes at a prolific, almost manic pace. He was generating millions of dollars. He was discovering and launching the careers of future global superstars like Migos, Future, and Waka Flocka Flame. His independent label, 1017 Brick Squad, was an underground empire. But behind the diamond-encrusted chains and the sold-out nightclub appearances, the man was actively disintegrating. The corporate-sponsored bounty placed on his head by young Jeezy and the subsequent fatal shootout in Decator had fundamentally broken his nervous system. When you are forced to take a human life to protect your property, and the men who ordered the robbery are still actively hunting you with the backing of a major crime syndicate, paranoia ceases to be a symptom. It becomes a strict requirement for survival. Gucci Mane could not trust anyone. The music industry had taught him that even a collaborative studio session could devolve into an extortion attempt. He viewed every handshake as a potential trap, and every newly signed artist as a potential liability. To manage the unbearable, crushing weight of this daily terror, he escalated his self-medication, his dependency on lean, the highly addictive mixture of prescription codeine and promethazine, morphed from a coping mechanism into a life-threatening addiction. He was consuming massive, lethal quantities of the narcotic syrup, compounding it with heavy alcohol abuse and prescription pills. The physiological reality of this chemical cocktail is devastating. The codeine suppresses the central nervous system, numbing the immediate terror of his post-traumatic stress disorder. But the sheer volume he consumed severely impaired his cognitive function, his emotional regulation, and his impulse control. He was a man drowning in plain sight. He gained massive amounts of weight. His speech became slurred. He became violently erratic, alienating his closest friends, his family, and his most loyal business partners. He was frequently involved in physical altercations, often attacking people over perceived slights or sudden bouts of drug-induced paranoia. The most damning aspect of this descent is how the music industry reacted to it. They did not stage an intervention. They did not suggest psychiatric help. The corporate media apparatus, the hip-hop blogs, the radio stations, and the major labels distributing his independent projects weaponized his mental illness. They viewed his severe addiction and violent outbursts not as a medical crisis, but as a highly lucrative content strategy. Every time Gucci Mane was arrested for battery, every time a new mugshot was released showing his bloated, heavily tattooed face, his streaming numbers and record sales spiked. The suburban consumers who purchased gangsta rap craved authenticity, and the industry served them Radric Davis's genuine psychological collapse on a silver platter. They printed his mugshots on t-shirts. They celebrated his ruthless, heavily armed persona. The system had figured out how to monetize his PTSD. They were extracting millions of dollars from a man who was desperately self-medicating to forget the smell of gunpowder in that Decator apartment. While Gucci Mane was fighting a brutal war of attrition against his own mind and the Atlanta justice system, the corporate machine was busy elevating his rival to the stratosphere. The contrast between the two men during this era exposes the sheer, sickening hypocrisy of the proxy war. Young Jeezy, the man who had utilized a public radio station to issue a $10,000 bounty that resulted in a homicide, was completely sanitized by Def Jam Records. The executives in New York effectively laundered his street reputation into corporate respectability. Jeezy was no longer just a trap rapper. He was a mainstream cultural icon. In 2008, he released the song My President, a celebratory anthem for Barack Obama's historic election campaign. The track was a massive crossover success. Suddenly, the man who had terrorized the Atlanta underground was mingling with politicians wearing tailored tuxedos and attending high society corporate galas. Def Jam had successfully executed their master plan. They had used the raw, violent credibility of the streets to launch Jeezy, and once he achieved global superstardom, they severed the public ties to the violence that built him. No mainstream journalist interviewing young Jeezy about his political activism asked him about Pookie Lock. No corporate sponsor questioned the morality of the bounty he had placed on another man's life. The multi-billion-dollar corporate shield was absolute. Jeezy was permitted to evolve, to heal, and to become a respected businessman. Gucci Mane was afforded no such luxury. Because he had refused to surrender his publishing rights, because he remained fiercely independent, he was left in the mud to deal with the consequences of the industry's greed. He was the villain in the narrative, the unpolished, erratic criminal, while the men who had orchestrated his trauma drank champagne in VIP lounges. By 2013, the structural integrity of Radric Davis's mind finally collapsed. The decade of severe trauma, relentless drug abuse, and legal harassment reached a catastrophic breaking point. The paranoia had isolated him completely. He had engaged in bitter public fallouts with his most successful protégés, including Waka Flocka Flame. Severing the few remaining genuine relationships he had, he was operating in a total vacuum, surrounded only by enablers and the terrifying echoes of his own mind. In September of that year, the internal rot spilled out into the public domain in spectacular fashion. Over the course of several days, Gucci Mane launched a massive, erratic, and deeply offensive tirade on Twitter. He attacked almost every major figure in the music industry. He insulted label executives, fellow artists, and his former friends. He aired highly personal, destructive grievances, burning every bridge he had ever built. To the general public and the media, it looked like a hilarious drug-fueled meltdown. The internet turned his breakdown into a meme. But to anyone analyzing the root cause, it was the tragic, desperate rebellion of a broken man. He was lashing out at an industry that had consumed him. He was attacking the fake, sanitized ecosystem of the music business, screaming at the executives who had profited off his blood and the peers who had watched him suffer. It was a chaotic, self-destructive attempt to burn the entire system down, even if it meant burning himself alive in the process. The consequences of this collapse were immediate and severe. Days after the social media meltdown, the reality of his paranoia manifested in a final grim encounter with law enforcement. In the early hours of September 14th, 2013, police responded to a call in Atlanta regarding an individual behaving erratically in the street. They found Radrick Davis pacing the pavement. He was heavily intoxicated, highly agitated, and carrying a loaded Glock handgun and marijuana. Because of his extensive criminal history, the situation rapidly escalated from a local arrest to a federal indictment. Federal prosecutors charged him with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. This was not a minor state charge that could be negotiated away by a high-priced local attorney. This was the United States federal government. Given his previous convictions, the mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines were draconian. Gucci Mane was suddenly facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. As the heavy steel doors of the federal holding facility slammed shut, the corporate executives in New York could finally close the book on the icy dispute. The independent artist who had dared to defy Def Jam Records, the man who had refused to hand over his intellectual property, was effectively neutralized. The system had won. They had extracted his cultural value. They had monetized his trauma. They had used his violent reputation to sell millions of records. And now he was entirely disposable. The music industry immediately moved on. They began scouting the next generation of traumatized young men from impoverished neighborhoods, ready to offer them predatory contracts and throw them into the exact same meat grinder. Radrick Davis was written off as a tragic, cautionary tale, a talented artist who simply could not escape his own demons. But this narrative completely absolves the architects of the tragedy. Gucci Mane did not self-destruct in a vacuum. His demons were meticulously fed and watered by the corporate music machine. The lean addiction, the paranoia, the heavily armed lifestyle. These were not character flaws. They were direct psychological responses to surviving what had functionally become a proxy war fueled by industry pressure. As Gucci Mane sat in a maximum security federal cell, completely cut off from his wealth, his music, and his freedom, he was forced into a brutal period of absolute sobriety. The codeine was gone. The enablers were gone. The noise of the industry was silenced. For the first time in nearly 10 years, he was left entirely alone with his own mind, forced to confront the wreckage of his life and the memory of the body buried behind the middle school. The executives expected him to rot in that cage. They expected the story to end with Radrick Davis becoming just another statistical casualty of the American penal system, a forgotten footnote in the history of Southern hip-hop. They fundamentally underestimated the resilience of a man who had already survived the trap, a home invasion, and a decade of psychological warfare. The proxy war had stripped him of everything, but the isolation of federal prison was about to strip away the addiction, leaving only the cold, calculating survivor underneath. The empire had broken the man, but they were about to realize that they had accidentally forged a weapon they could no longer control. The heavy steel doors of the United States federal penitentiary system do not merely lock a man physically inside a cage. They force him into a brutal, unavoidable confrontation with his own mind. In late 2013, Radrick Davis, facing up to 20 years for firearm possession, was stripped of his jewelry, his designer clothing, and his independent empire. But most terrifyingly, he was stripped of his chemical armor. Entering a maximum security federal facility meant an immediate, involuntary, and agonizing withdrawal from a decade-long addiction to promethazine and codeine. The physical reality of cold turkey opiate withdrawal in a concrete cell is a biological nightmare. It involves severe tremors, insomnia, vomiting, and a crushing, inescapable depression. For weeks, Gucci Mane suffered through this physiological hell, completely isolated from the sycophants, the enablers, and the corporate executives who had cheered on his self-destruction. This is the exact moment the music industry expected him to expire. The corporate machine had successfully extracted millions of dollars from his erratic behavior, his arrests, and his highly publicized feuds. They had used his very real, documented trauma to sell an authentic gangsta rap narrative to suburban America. Now that he was locked away by the federal government, his utility as a marketing tool was exhausted. The record labels, the hip-hop blogs, and the radio stations simply pivoted. They turned their cameras and their promotional budgets toward a new generation of traumatized young men from Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, ready to initiate the exact same cycle of exploitation. The system wrote Radrick Davis off as collateral damage, but they fundamentally miscalculated the psychological composition of the man they had trapped. As the chemical fog of the narcotics slowly cleared from his brain, Gucci Mane experienced a profound and devastating clarity. Sitting in a federal cell, he began to analyze the previous 10 years of his life not as a participant, but as a victim of a massive corporate proxy war. He recognized that the bounty placed on his head, the fatal shooting of Pookie Locke, and his subsequent decade of crippling paranoia were not the natural consequences of his environment. They were the direct results of a multi-billion-dollar corporation demanding the copyright to his intellectual property. He realized that by playing the role of the heavily armed, heavily medicated villain, he had not been rebelling against the system. He had been doing exactly what the system required of him. His trauma was their product. His paranoia was their marketing campaign. His potential death was their ultimate promotional strategy. In that cell, Radrick Davis made a cold, calculated decision. He refused to die as a corporate pawn. He initiated one of the most remarkable physical and psychological transformations in the history of the American entertainment industry. He began reading voraciously, studying business, psychology, and biographies. He began a rigorous daily exercise regimen, treating his physical health with the same intense discipline he had once used to survive the drug trade. He lost nearly 100 pounds. He flushed the remaining toxicity from his system. He completely rewired his autonomic nervous system, learning to suppress the hypervigilance that had kept him awake with an assault rifle for 10 years. He took absolute control of his business affairs from the inside. Even while incarcerated, he directed his team to release dozens of pre-recorded mixtapes, flooding the market and ensuring his independent label, 1017 Brick Squad, remained highly profitable. He was no longer reacting to the trauma mandated by the industry. He was manipulating the industry from a federal prison cell. In May 2016, Radrick Davis was granted early release. He walked out of the penitentiary and stepped back into the world. He was physically unrecognizable. He was lean, highly muscular, entirely sober, and for the first time in his public life, he was smiling. His eyes were clear. The heavy, sluggish drawl caused by the syrup was gone, replaced by sharp, articulate speech. The public reaction to his release is a dark, incredibly revealing indictment of how society views black men who have been marketed as violent criminals. The transformation was so absolute and so contrary to the tragic trajectory the media had prepared for him that a massive internet conspiracy theory emerged. Millions of people genuinely believed that the United States government had cloned Gucci Mane. The clone theory sounds absurd, but its psychological root is deeply disturbing. The public and the media literally could not comprehend that a man could survive severe trauma, beat a lethal addiction, serve federal time, and emerge healed. The system is so conditioned to see these men return in body bags or life sentences that a successful, healthy rehabilitation was deemed biologically impossible. Society expected a broken monster. When they received a disciplined businessman, they assumed it was science fiction. Gucci Mane ignored the noise. He reclaimed his throne, but he entirely rewrote the rules of his engagement with the industry. He married his longtime partner, Keisha Coer, who had helped him rebuild his empire while he was inside. He secured massive corporate partnerships, wrote a best-selling autobiography, and elevated his net worth into the tens of millions. He became a master capitalist, but this time he owned the board. He completely insulated himself from the street-level violence that Def Jam and the radio stations had previously used to manipulate him. But while Gucci Mane was building his new impenetrable reality, a ghost was still waiting in the shadows. The blood spilled over the song Icy had never been formally addressed. For 15 years, Gucci Mane and young Jeezy had existed in a state of heavily armed, silent hostility. They had not occupied the same room since 2005. Jeezy had continued his highly successful corporate-backed career, cultivating an image of a matured executive and community leader. But the unresolved trauma of the Decator shootout hung over both men. Jeezy carried the guilt of deploying a close friend to secure a corporate asset, resulting in that friend's death. Gucci carried the scars of being forced to kill a man to protect his property. In November 2020, the corporate music machine engineered a scenario that brought this 15-year proxy war to a final surreal conclusion. The platform Versus, a digital webcast series created during the pandemic where artists play their hit records against one another, orchestrated a face-off between Gucci Mane and young Jeezy. The event was sponsored by Apple Music and Ciroc Vodka. Millions of viewers tuned in live. Once again, multinational corporations were utilizing the underlying threat of gang violence to drive unprecedented streaming numbers. The event showed how major platforms could profit from the unresolved tension of a conflict that had already cost real people too much. They were placing two men with a long and genuinely dangerous history into the same room and turning that tension into a global spectacle. The atmosphere in that room was suffocating. The tension was not theatrical. It was terrifyingly authentic. Millions of viewers watched, holding their breath, wondering if a 15-year blood feud was about to erupt into live gunfire on the internet. Gucci Mane fully aware of the corporate spectacle, decided to strip away the sanitized commercial veneer of the event. He refused to let the executives or the audience forget the reality of what this feud was actually built upon. Midway through the broadcast, looking directly at young Jeezy, Gucci Mane performed the song Truth. It is a scathing, brutal track where Gucci explicitly details the night of the home invasion. He aggressively rapped the lyrics, reminding Jeezy that he had killed his friend, Pookie Lock, and mockingly told Jeezy to go dig your partner up. The air left the room. It was a moment of shocking, unvarnished cruelty, but it was also a necessary, unfiltered expression of severe trauma. Gucci Mane was sitting across from the man whose radio bounty had forced him to take a human life. A man who had gone on to become a multi-millionaire corporate darling while Gucci fought a decade of PTSD and federal charges. He was forcing Jeezy and the millions watching to look directly at the corpse that the record labels had conveniently swept under the rug. Young Jeezy remained remarkably stoic. The older, matured executive recognized the volatility of the moment. He did not retaliate with aggression. He absorbed the verbal blow, and when the music stopped, he spoke directly to Gucci Mane. He did not speak about record sales or publishing rights. He spoke about the young men in the streets of Atlanta who were currently killing each other over the exact same corporate engineered nonsense. He extended an olive branch, and then the impossible happened. The DJ triggered the instrumental beat for Icy, the very song that had initiated the proxy war, the song that Def Jam had tried to steal, the song that carried a $10,000 bounty, the song that had cost Henry Lee Clark III his life. Gucci Mane and young Jeezy stood up, and for the first time in 15 years, they performed the song together. When the track ended, the two men approached each other. They looked into each other's eyes, acknowledging a shared, devastating history that no one else in the world could truly understand. They shook hands. They called a truce. The internet erupted in celebration. The media branded it a historic moment of healing and unity in hip-hop. The reconciliation became a major commercial moment as well, showing that the industry could profit not only from conflict, but also from the spectacle of resolution. But when the cameras were turned off and the executives tallied their streaming revenue, the reality of that handshake remained profoundly hollow. It was a hollow victory because the true cost of the corporate manipulation can never be refunded. The record labels, the radio stations, and the digital streaming platforms won. They extracted 15 years of unparalleled financial profit from this conflict. Def Jam secured young Jeezy's status as a legend. Independent distributors profited off Gucci Mane's prolific, trauma-induced output. Apple Music profited off the reunion. But look at the men who fought the war. Henry Lee Clark III is dead. He was manipulated by the promise of corporate favor and a quick payday, and his reward was a bullet to the chest and a shallow grave behind a middle school. He is a permanent casualty of a boardroom strategy. Young Jeezy carries the heavy, unspoken burden of knowing that his ego, inflamed by the pressure of his corporate employers, directly resulted in the death of a man who trusted him. And Radrick Davis? He survived. He achieved massive wealth, sobriety, and a level of peace that once seemed entirely impossible. But he lost a decade of his life to severe addiction, extreme paranoia, and federal incarceration. He was forced to cross the ultimate moral boundary, taking a life to defend a copyright. The psychological toll of that action is a debt that no amount of multi-platinum plaques can ever repay. When those two men shook hands in 2020, it was not merely a gesture of forgiveness between rivals. It was the tragic, silent realization of two seasoned veterans who finally understood that they had spent their entire adult lives fighting a war on behalf of an empire that did not care if they lived or died. They were both pawns on a chessboard designed by men in tailored suits. They stopped fighting because they finally recognized that the only entity bleeding in a proxy war is the mercenary. The Verzuz handshake in 2020 was celebrated as a historic moment of healing. Apple Music and the labels counted their massive streaming revenues. Yet the true cost of Icy remains unpaid. Henry Lee Clark III rests in a shallow grave. Young Jeezy carries the weight of a deadly radio boast. And Radrick Davis lost a decade of his life to severe paranoia and federal prison, forced to cross the ultimate moral line simply to defend his own copyright. They survived the meat grinder, but they stand as permanent monuments to a ruthless truth. When the music industry goes to war over market share, the executives never fire the guns. They just hand the weapons to the desperate and charge the public for a front row seat.